think we're going to have Eric, you're on too.
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, we're going to get started with this session. This is session 7, how missionaries and lines on maps shaped Alaska history. So we have 3 wonderful presentations here, and I will actually introduce each speaker before they speak, because I think that gives us a little bit of time to change the slides over to the next speaker, rather than just giving it all to you now. My name is Molly McCammon. I'm on the board of the Alaska Historical Society, so it's great to see all of you here, and I know people will be trickling in after lunch. We had kind of a short lunch session because we had a really good presentation on the bars of Cordova, so looking forward to our tour tonight. But our first presentation is the origins of the Sitka Mission, rights, responsibilities, race, and religion. And this is regarding Sitka's Presbyterian mission started in 1878. The speaker will be Rebecca Paulson, who just actually left the board of the Alaska Historical Society. She's been on the board for a long time. She's an artist and writer in Sitka. She's on the board of the Sitka Maritime Heritage Society, has been on the Alaska Historical Society, and is also a member of the Alaska Historical Commission. So Rebecca, why don't you go ahead?
All right, thank you. So the origins of the Sitka Mission, and more specifically, what was the relationship between Sitka's Presbyterian mission, which was later known as Sheldon Jackson School, and the Alaska Native pursuit of citizenship, civil rights, and land claims. So Alaska became part of the United States in 1867 and was effectively ruled by the U.S. Army until 1877. The mission began in 1878. And of course, it was 17 years after the transfer before Alaska got civil government with the 1884 Organic Act. So the origin of the fight for rights and of the mission lie in that decade of Army rule. So first, Tlingit rights in 1867. So land rights. The Treaty of Cession transferred what Russia, quote unquote, possessed in North America to the United States. But what that was not defined. Most of what they claimed was held only by the doctrine of discovery, which was the policy originating in Europe in the 1400s that says lands can be claimed for whatever Christian sovereign nation claims it first. And that assumes that indigenous people have no rights to their lands. So right after the transfer, how do I advance? Big far? Yeah, I think this is, I got an arrow, got a space bar. Yeah.
Oh, there. Right.
Okay.
Well, can you see that? Just click
Okay.
on that. Sorry, that's what.
Okay. Yep, we found it, found a little button. So right after the transfer, Tlingit leaders told Army General Jeff Davis that they did not recognize American claims. Davis told them they had no choice. In a report for Congress, he wrote that they were unaware of the doctrine of discovery. Before 1867, Tlingit people did have control over all of their lands. As General Davis put it, quote, before the transfer, they looked upon themselves as the de facto rulers of this territory and the Russians only as traders here by permission or sufferance. So, and rights of citizenship and sovereignty next. So Tlingit people were excluded from citizenship as, quote, uncivilized tribes. They were, however, occasionally treated as sovereign in the right to apply their own laws to internal affairs, and even on occasion for their law to be respected by the United States. So in Tlingit law, this is very general, an injury or death, even if accidental, has to be compensated. For very serious matters, this could mean a life for a life of equivalent importance, but was normally in material compensation. And this was generally followed in the region by Russians and by foreign traders. So legally recognizing that sovereignty. Whoops. Oh, man. So the button is behind another button. I'm not being able to get to it. Yeah. So the,
So just kind of have it right there. Just leave the
Okay.
mouse right there. And when you're ready to press, just go.
okay. So legally recognizing sovereignty meant technically defining whether or not Alaska was, quote, Indian country. But this was very confused and in dispute throughout this period and well into the 1880s. So in practice, the usual approach by the military was that Indians needed to be kept from attacking through a show of force and by putting down pride or insolence. And this was, of course, the usual approach in the Indian Wars, which were then at their height. And that led to the shelling of the Cake villages, shelling of a village at Wrangell in 1869, and to the destruction of much of Angoon in 1882. However, military leaders throughout the period also sometimes honored the Tlingit system as, a pragmatic matter. So here is some context for those Tlingit rights in 1867. These are pictures by Mybridge from 1868. This is a picture of Sitka in 1793, and it was taken from, or drawn from the deck of a British fur trade vessel. So the maritime fur trade from 1784 through the 1810s, European and American traders joined in the pre-existing Northwest Coast trade system, and they traded on indigenous terms. Hundreds of thousands of sea otter pelts were sold in Canton, China. Nearly all of these purchased directly from Northwest Coast indigenous people. And this relationship brought enormous wealth to Boston and to the Tlingit. And it did not diminish their control over their lands and resources. So next is the nature of Russian colonization in southeastern Alaska. So beginning in the mid-1700s, Russian fur companies worked their way along the Aleutian chain and into the Gulf of Alaska, coercing native labor to hunt sea otter for them. So, but by the 1780s and until they pulled out, their profits were based on a system of underpaying an indigenous workforce based in the Aleutians, Kodiak Island, and eventually the Pribilofs. And that was the case. That was what their profit depended on all the way up until 1867, which is one reason they pulled out. By the time the Russians came into southeastern Alaska in the 1790s, Sitka Sound was a regular port of call for American and British traders. So they tried to extend their system with hundreds of hunters into southeast. They negotiated for a hunting base at Gajahin near Sitka in 1799. It was destroyed in 1802. Then after the Battle of Sitka in 1804, established a port at Sitka. But the Kiksati, that was the clan that owned Sitka, Kiksati leaders ceded only the right to have that post. They were not allowed to hunt for themselves, but had to trade for furs, just like everybody else. And their post at Sitka was mainly to claim the coast from other Europeans in the United States per the doctrine of discovery. In the mid-1850s, yeah, there it is. Who wants to open up other things? See, in the mid-1850s, Tlingit people attacked the fort. Russians were killed. But instead of retaliating, the Russians blamed their governor, who they had already fired for letting relations disintegrate. They worked to make peace, and they regularly paid for injury done by Russians. And Tlingit hegemony extended to forcing the Hudson's Bay Company to abandon trading posts up the Stikine River in 1838, at Taku in 1842, and above Chilkat on the Yukon in 1852. Another important piece of context for the period is the devastating population loss between 1800 and 1867, and that continued. Russians estimated the population of Southeast Alaska around 1800 at over 50,000 people, which is similar to the population today. By 1867, the population as counted by the US government was fewer than 8,000 and falling. At Stikine, which had been the gateway for a gold rush in the early 1860s, American officials said that the population had been 1,500 only a few years before. It was only 1,000 and falling in 1867. And a lot of that was probably due to smallpox epidemics because most Native people did not have access to inoculation. And probably the most important to the context of the Army decade is the state of the economy. That probably contributed to those numbers of deaths. In 1867 and throughout the Army years, the economy practically ceased to exist. Money coming in was basically the federal payroll and miners passing through and a very much attenuated fur trade. And like other depressed places, much of the trade that existed was in alcohol. The United States and Europe were in the long depression of the 1870s, which most likely depressed the fur markets. And American traders aggressively displaced Tlingit from what trade there was. So all of this, losing control of lands and resources, probably factored into Tlingit leaders asking for education and missions of military leaders. And also in the late 1870s, missionaries and others associated with them came, and they were all, there was a lot of requests, for schools and missions, and all mentioned Metlakatla. So Metlakatla in Canada. So missionary William Duncan had gone to Fort Simpson, so just south of the border with the US in 1856. He gained a following that included clan leaders because English literacy was seen as a valuable asset. Duncan and converts built a town at Metlakatla near present-day Prince Rupert. At that new village, within a few years, thanks to mission funds coming in, they had a sawmill, they had new frame houses. In 1862, a smallpox epidemic struck the coast, but only a few lives were lost at Metlakatla. Later, they even had their own cannery. So the request for missions and schools by the Tlingit, since it was based on the model of William Duncan, could have been driven in part by an effort to get control of sawmills and other commercial operations. A Huna leader told missionary John Brady that his people wanted a sawmill and that they would gladly pay for the boards. So the earliest Protestant missionaries in Alaska were a group of Methodist Tsimshian Native men of Wrangell during the Cassiar Gold Rush in the mid-1870s. So a letter written by a soldier in 1877 pleading for missionaries to continue that work came into Presbyterian missionary Sheldon Jackson's hands. So Sheldon Jackson was an extremely ambitious Presbyterian missionary, determined to pioneer Alaska, get his name in the history books, even though it was technically not his to pioneer. He parlayed that letter by getting it published in the Chicago Tribune and in his newspaper, the Rocky Mountain Presbyterian, which he later called the Home Missions Monthly, into funds for his project. He brought missionary Amanda McFarland to Wrangell, where she started a girls' home. This is years later. So all of these people, military leaders, John Muir, missionaries, they were seeing Native people who were experiencing a lot of death, alcohol, violence, and a severe lack of economic resources. All expressed their belief that this situation was due to the natives themselves, that Native people were suffering because they were vulnerable to alcohol and to being exploited by, quote, bad whites, and that Native culture was primitive and inadequate for surviving in the modern world. And Sheldon Jackson exaggerated that supposed inadequacy of Native culture in order to establish the need for the work of the missionaries and to raise funds. So this extreme portrayal of Native depravity and vulnerability was in contrast with descriptions of how well Alaska Native people did in school. Because it was based on the notion that Native culture was the problem, missionary goals for Native rights diverged from the expressed goals of Native people themselves, which was to have their civil rights respected and to have their ownership of land and resources recognized in order to get compensation for their use. So first of all, missionaries never supported the acknowledgement of that land ownership. And Native civil rights were supported only on condition that Natives first become, quote, civilized and stop participating in Native social and political life, which hindered or prevented collective Native political empowerment. So Sheldon Jackson did not invent this characterization, but I believe that his outsized influence in this very critical period of transition between Alaska as an inchoate, lawless possession into Alaska that we recognize today embedded his portrayal of Alaska Native people, who were then, of course, the majority of the population, into our conception of Alaska even now. So next, the origin of the Sitka mission. So in 1878, Jackson had sent missionary John Brady and teacher Fanny Kellogg to Sitka, where they started a day school. Both left that same year. In 1879, Presbyterian missionary Alonzo Austin came to Sitka, and his daughter restarted the day school for natives in 1880. The Sitka school saw initial success due to the enthusiasm of the earliest group of students, who included young men of standing in Tlingit society. Sheldon Jackson, the person, parlayed that into more funds and more influence. Soon, some of the boys asked for permission to live at the school. Their school building, which is in this picture, the old Russian hospital, burned down in January 1882. The Presbyterians acquired the land that is now the inside, that is now the Sheldon Jackson College campus. And then these young men and Austin and others built this very large school building. In 1884, Congress passed Alaska's Organic Act, providing limited civil government in Alaska for the first time. Sheldon Jackson had a hand in its development. Missions received government funding, and Sheldon Jackson became Alaska's general agent for education, which he held, I think, almost all the way until he died in 1909. So the first officials of Alaska's first civil government arrived at Sitka in the fall of 1884. That was a district judge, district attorney, and a federal marshal. The first term of the court in May 1885 was busy, and 9 of the first 21 cases were against the mission. So case number 6 was by the widow of a man who held a competing claim to the mission property. She lost. Case number 7 was based on a petition by a group of residents protesting the Presbyterian land claim, saying it would create a, quote, second Indian village that would threaten the white town, and that the land was properly part of the town site. The Presbyterian plat for the mission school was actually written into the Organic Act itself, which promised 640 acres to any, quote, established mission. The petition was brought by a group that included many Russian or Creole Sitkans and several miners. When the United States had assumed control of Alaska, Russians and those associated with them were offered citizenship. Nearly all of the Russians who stayed in Alaska had Alaska Native heritage and were known as Creoles by the Russian American Company, but called themselves Russians. They were a majority of the white population of Sitka and were not happy with the mission's rapid growth. Case number 7 gave rise to cases number 16, 18, 19, 20, and 21 against Sheldon Jackson personally. 18 through 21 are all about him building a fence around the mission and encroaching on the right-of-way. Those cases were all dismissed and did not seem to have any permanent impact on the mission or on Native rights, but cases 9 and 10 did. These were petitions on behalf of the families of 2 students who wanted to leave the school. the court decided that it was not legal to make a contract with a Native person, and that a person could not be held against their will. The mission made parents sign a 5-year contract in order to send their children to school. According to Sheldon Jackson, the court decision led to more than half of the students at the school leaving. But thanks to Sheldon Jackson's influence with the incoming president, that first set of officials were dismissed, and Alaska's next officials in 1886 were his supporters. When that court heard case number 32 the following year, in 1886, a petition by a mother wishing to take her son out of the school, the new judge decided that the school could not let that child go home because that would, quote, render all efforts of both the government and missions to civilize them abortive. In Jackson's first annual report on education for 1885, he described losing half the student body who would, quote, go back to the filth, superstition, degradation, and vice of their native condition. So after 1885, the way was clear for Sheldon Jackson's mission, except that perhaps it was no longer as attractive as it had been. Membership in the Russian Orthodox Church expanded exponentially in the later 1880s, so right after this. Still, the Presbyterian Church maintained a Tlingit membership, and families sent their children for generations, like well into 1970s. So finally, to the question of how Sheldon Jackson's school helped prepare the young people who went to that school, who went on to found the Alaska Native Brotherhood in 1912, and ultimately work toward the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. So first we have to recognize as erroneous the notion that Native people ever needed any different education than anyone else did. They did not need to learn about commerce or technology any more than do white students. And they did not have to have their Native identities erased in order to learn. And this notion, of course, is belied by the history of success Native people saw in the centuries before Europeans arrived, and their successful economic and political relationships with British, American, and Russian leaders. And next, to see the school in the context of the environment of the 20th century, which was pervaded with that belief that Native people were indeed handicapped by being Native, pervasive racial bias. So that bias was justified by Sheldon Jackson's characterization of Native people as not ready for self-government or citizenship, needing help to adjust to white society and culture. That belief persisted throughout the 20th century, ranging from a statement by a missionary in 1908 about racial inferiority to the widespread belief that Native people were culturally adapted to simply living off the land, and so needed help to learn how to adapt to a market economy. And we see that narrative today in the ascription of modern health problems to culture clash between Tlingit and European culture, and in the notion that Native people are culturally more susceptible to alcohol, rather than to the actual cause, systemic racial bias that led to massive loss of life. So that climate of bias in the 20th century led to people being pushed out to the edges of Alaska has through most of our time, it's had a pretty depressed economy. It was harder to have a job that wasn't physically dangerous, harder to have access to healthcare and good housing. And this led to unbelievably high rates of premature death, especially for babies and young people. And I recently worked with the 1930 census and death records in Sitka for the 30s. For young people in 2022, the rate of death is less than 1 in 1,000 per year. For young people in Sitka from Native families, that rate was 43. So that disparity in health and wealth between Native and non-Native people today is a direct result of being the targets of racial bias by missionaries as well as other authorities based on that conception that Native culture is inadequate. So Sheldon Jackson School undoubtedly did help students who went there. But of course they had no other option since they were barred from Sitka's public high school until 1949. I have heard from graduates, especially in the 40s and 50s, that was where the students developed a pan-Alaska Native identity, which definitely was a factor in fighting for land claims. Also, Sheldon Jackson was a private school. And students had to want to attend, or their parents had to want them to attend, and had to pay tuition. Students were self-selecting as people who could handle or even thrive in a boarding school environment. And we see then that the achievements of Sheldon Jackson graduates were their own. Sheldon Jackson gave them an opportunity, and but the very lack of other opportunities was due to the beliefs that had been promoted by Sheldon Jackson, the person. So missionaries, by and large, truly intended to help Native people, and many did, literally saving lives and encouraging young people to pursue their dreams. Students took advantage of what the school had to offer as a stepping stone in an unfair world. So the relationship between the mission and Native rights. So the mission, along with government, was instrumental in limiting rights. For example, only granting citizenship on the condition of leaving Native cultural and political identity. And it was based on the stereotype of that being incompatible with success. So when we see this stereotype for what it is, we can appreciate what the school did besides advancing that notion. And by looking at the history and the beliefs and assumptions of that other time, we can also discern how those beliefs and assumptions persist. And we have a better understanding of our past and of where we are now.
Thank you. Okay, that was great. We're going to hold questions to the end. We're going to go now to a remote presentation by Eric Johnson. Eric is a historian with the National Park Service. He's just rejoined the board of the Alaska Historical Society. He lives in Anchorage, and he'll be speaking about Fort Seward and the Alaska boundary dispute. So again, how lines on the maps have shaped Alaska's history. Go ahead, Eric. Are you going to do his slides? No, he's going to do them. He's going to do slides. He's going to share his screen. Okay.
Gonna try. Thanks, Molly.
Okay. Okay,
Let's
great. Once he's on, it might be better than here. Yep.
Is that slide visible?
No,
No.
no.
No. Okay.
Okay. Kayla's gonna do her magic here.
How about now?
No,
Not yet. Are you hitting share screen?
Yeah.
Oh, wait, it's changing. Hold up. All right.
okay. All right.
The slide is up?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. And that was great to hear from Rebecca, because the area that I'm going to be talking about was also affected by Presbyterian missionaries prior to the fort being there. And I wish I was there in Cordova, but next best thing, I guess, is talking to the computer. This presentation is going to be about Fort William H. Seward, which is a National Historic Landmark in Haines. And I'm a historian for the National Park Service, and part of my job is working to preserve Alaska's 50 National Historic Landmarks, or what we call NHLs in shorthand. I've recently been working with colleagues to update the Fort Seward NHL documentation that was originally completed in the 1970s, when they had less guidance than we have today. The updated documentation our team worked on expands the historic context to include more information about the fort's national significance and describes in detail the different buildings and resources associated with the landmark. Fort Seward is considered a historic district because there are many buildings that help to tell its story. A couple weeks ago, I presented the update to the National Historic Landmarks Committee, which is a group of scholars and experts who review, comment, and vote on NHL nominations. We hope and expect this update to be formalized by the Secretary of Interior sometime in 2025. This presentation has a couple components. I will explain what the fort is from a National Historic Landmark perspective, while also describing its historic significance related to the Alaska boundary dispute and the turn of the 20th century Alaska gold rush. I will finish by giving a tour of what the historic district looks like today. Fort Seward is located on the southeast side of Haines in Alaska's Panhandle. It is situated on the Chilkat Peninsula along the Lynn Canal, which is the largest fjord in the United States. The area that contains the fort is the ancestral and current homeland of the Chilkoot and Chilkat Tlingits. You can see how close the fort sits to the Canadian border. North of Haines, the towns of Skagway and nearby Dyea at the head of the Lynn Canal were jumping off points for gold seekers trying to access the Klondike goldfields in Canada's Yukon Territory. At Skagway, they had access to the White Pass Trail that led 45 miles to Lake Bennett and then onto the gold fields. At Dyea, there was the Chilkoot Trail that was 33 miles en route to Lake Bennett. These routes were historically controlled by Tlingits who exercised power over trade between interior Athabascans and foreign parties prior to the gold rush. Both Skagway and Dyea and the respective trails are now each National Historic Landmarks themselves. This map on the left probably does a better job showing where Haines is relative to Skagway and Dyea. This entire area was contested by Canada in the late 1890s. On the right is a map from 1903 with the dark shaded area west of British Columbia showing the territory in dispute. Essentially, Canada made a push to control the Upper Lynn Canal and Pyramid Harbor area with access points to the Klondike. This included Skagway, Dyea, and Haines. In the late 1800s, tens of thousands of people came through the Upper Lynn Canal and transformed Alaska and Canada politically, socially, and economically. The Canadians wanted jurisdiction over the Upper Lynn Canal and Pyramid Harbor area, which provided the quickest overland access to the Klondike. In effect, they were challenging boundary descriptions that were part of an 1825 treaty between Russia and Great Britain. In this photo, you can see the United States flag on the right and the British Union Jack flag on the left, with 9 prospectors standing in between. It's important to note that although Canada had become a semi-sovereign nation in 1867, which is the same year that the US purchased Alaska from Russia, Great Britain still exercised power over Canada's foreign policy, and the Dominion of Canada did not have full legal autonomy. And the Canadian national flag with the maple leaf debuted in 1965. In 1898, the conflict and contention over the boundary led to a trilateral joint high commission between Great Britain, the US, and Canada after Canadian Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier and Interior Minister Clifford Sifton declared the head of the Lynn Canal disputed territory. Canada claimed the 1825 treaty with Russia actually gave the heads of all inlets in Southeast Alaska to Canada. While the dispute was ongoing, the United States was emboldened by victories in the Spanish-American War. Late that same year, the War Department set aside a reservation at Haines Mission, 15 miles south of Skagway. It was a location that was in the disputed territory, but allowed plenty of room to build and also the ability to observe all the trails leading to the Klondike. The Alaska boundary dispute of the late 1890s has its origins in the Anglo-Russian Treaty of 1825. This treaty was a result of the reaction to the ukase or proclamation of 1821, where the Russians attempted to exert control over Northwest America and the Pacific Ocean from 55 degrees northern latitude to 51 degrees northern latitude. And the latter is essentially the northern tip of Vancouver Island. The British and US protested and both executed treaties with the Russians. The Anglo-Russian Treaty of 1825 ultimately determined the boundaries of Russia-America, or what would become Alaska, and British possessions in the Northwest. The 141st meridian delineated the long straight boundary that runs north from much of Alaska's western border. The Southeast Panhandle was a bit more complex, and translated from the French, the treaty said the following, quote, "The line of demarcation between possessions of the high contracting parties, commencing from the southernmost point of the island called Prince of Wales Island, shall ascend to the north along the channel called Portland Channel, as far as the 56th degree of north latitude. From this last mentioned point of the line of demarcation shall follow the summit of the mountain situated parallel to the coast as far as the 141st degree of west longitude. That whenever the summit of the mountains which extend in a direction parallel to the coast shall prove to be at a distance of more than 10 marine leagues from the ocean, the limit between British possessions and the line of coast, which is to belong to Russia, shall be formed by a line parallel to the windings of the coast, and which shall never exceed the distance of 10 marine leagues therefrom. And by the way, 10 marine leagues is roughly 34.5 miles. This is a map from 1872, which interprets how the 1825 boundaries were mostly understood without a survey. The map is labeled Northwestern America, showing the territory ceded by Russia to the United States. On the left here, you can see a map of Southeast Alaska that was published in 1827 and was an attempted understanding of the 1825 treaty boundary lines. If you look at just this map and don't follow the description language of the treaty, the Upper Lynn Canal falls into Russia America that was eventually sold to the United States. The map on the right was published in 1836. It is interesting to look at the boundaries and names of territories just a few decades before the Alaska Purchase. We can see where Mexico used to be in the western extent of the United States. What we understand to be the American and Canadian Pacific Northwest now is labeled Columbia, while Alaska is called Russian territory, but a boundary is clearly delineated in the pink color. This map appears to concede that the Upper Lynn Canal is a part of Russian territory. Following the treaty, a boundary survey was never deployed by the Russians or the British. As I probably said earlier, the 1825 treaty defined the boundaries of the 1867 Alaska Purchase by the United States. This is that 1872 map that is zoomed in on the panhandle. This boundary forms the American understanding of the border, which clearly contains the Upper Lynn Canal and would eventually become Skagway and Dyea. The same year this map was published, there was a gold strike in the Cassiar region of British Columbia, which led to President Grant's request for a boundary survey to clearly mark the border. Congress refused to act on Grant's request, which led to the contentious and potentially dangerous showdown in the late 1890s. The cartoon on the left appeared in the New York Herald in July 1899 and depicts a seated Uncle Sam wielding a knife, while in front of him, a little girl symbolizing Canada pulls on the tail of an eagle. The eagle's tail says Pyramid Harbor. On the other side of the girl is a man symbolizing Great Britain who is seated on a bench and holding a piece of paper. The caption reads, "If this small person is not restrained, the eagle may lose his temper." The Trilateral Joint High Commission that was formed in 1898 was dissolved in 1901 after backlash in the United States. While the Klondike Gold Rush was happening, the U.S. was becoming a formidable imperial power on the world stage following the Spanish-American War. The British were engulfed in the Boer Wars and not in a strong position to negotiate with the United States. In addition, President McKinley was assassinated, leaving Teddy Roosevelt as president. Roosevelt's speak softly and carry a big stick approach to foreign policy was connected to the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was to protect U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere. Following victories in the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt was emboldened and ready to exercise power. In 1903, there was a new Alaska Boundary Tribunal to settle the dispute. However, in 1902, the U.S. military had already moved into the Haines area to assert its authority and sovereignty over the region. Captain Charles Summerall, who was in command in Skagway, was ordered to Haines to build the fort. When Summerall arrived, the Canadian Northwest Police forbade him to begin construction because they said it was in disputed territory. Summerall responded by saying that this was American territory, and if they interfered, he would use force. And the clearing of land for Fort Seward commenced. In 1903, the Alaska Boundary Tribunal, with 6 judges made up of 3 Americans, 2 Canadians, and 1 Brit, voted in favor of the American boundary preference. There's been a lot of analysis of this decision, but the Americans ultimately came into the negotiation from a position of power relative to the Canadians, who were still dependent on the British, including in foreign policy decisions. The result of the tribunal was a point of humility for the Canadians and eventually led to changes leading to more sovereignty from Britain. Back to the Alaska Gold Rush real quick. Here is a 1897 map courtesy of the Library of Congress. you can see two main routes into the Klondike marked in red. I've already discussed the Chilkoot and White Pass trails, but the other access was around the west coast of Alaska to the Yukon River. The first military fort was set up in 1897 at Fort St. Michael, which is labeled on this map, on the west coast near where the Yukon flows into the Bering Sea. And it's the purpose of Fort St. Michael was to protect life and property during the gold rush. Fort St. Michael became the headquarters of the U.S. Army in Alaska for nearly 20 years, and at the height of its operation consisted of nearly 56 buildings. This map shows the location of the 12 turn-of-the-century military forts that were established in response to the Alaska gold rushes. There were the two West Coast forts, Fort Davis, established in 1900 at the mouth of the Nome River, and Fort St. Michael, which I just discussed. 5 forts were situated on the Yukon River, and they were Fort Gibbon at Tanana, Camp Rampart, Fort Yukon, Camp Circle City, and Fort Egbert, which was next to the town of Eagle near the Canadian border. Fort Liscombe was set up in Valdez. The scale of the map doesn't do a great job of differentiating between the location of forts at Dyea and Skagway because they're roughly 10 miles apart. Fort Wrangell was the farthest south, and Fort Seward was the final military fort established and is the most intact fort still remaining, and it's represented on this map with the gold flag. Now some quick stats and facts about the fort as a National Historic Landmark. The Fort Seward Historic District is roughly 37 acres, contains 29 contributing resources, which are almost all buildings that were constructed around 1904. The fort's colonial revival buildings are organized around a parade ground on a hillside descending to the waters at Chilkoot Inlet that reflects standardized turn of the 20th century fort design and architecture. National Historic Landmarks are evaluated for significance based on several types of criteria. Most NHLs are connected to significant events in American history, which is NHL Criteria 1, but also can be nominated for their relationship to important people, for exceptional architecture, or can be significant archaeology sites. The Fort Seward Historic District is nationally significant under Criterion 1 related to the themes of shaping the political landscape and the changing role of the United States in the world community. Fort Seward was an important military installment and connected to the Alaska Gold Rush, as well as the Alaska boundary dispute with Canada that occurred at the same time. It's the best remaining and intact example of the 12 Alaska military forts that were constructed as a part of the response to maintain order during the Alaska gold rushes. Fort Seward was constructed following plans for a permanent U.S. Army installation, reflecting the United States' confidence in its claim to the Upper Lynn Canal area of Alaska. And here are some historic photos of the fort. On the left is a historic photo looking southwest across the parade ground at Officers Row, and it was taken around 1908. On the right is a photo of soldiers doing drills in the parade ground circa 1924. The barracks building is on the right and the post exchange in the center left with the Chilkoot Inlet in the background. In the year 1922, the fort's official name changed from Fort Seward to the Chilkoot Barracks. From 1925 to 1940, Fort Seward, or Chilkoot Barracks, was the lone active Army installation in Alaska, and during World War II, the fort served as a recruitment station, rest stop, and training ground for troops involved in the Aleutian Campaign and the war effort throughout the territory. On the left there is a view from Officers Row on top of the parade ground out towards the Chilkoot Inlet circa 1924. And you can see some of the non-commissioned officers' quarters buildings and hospital in the background behind the groups of soldiers. On the right is a photo of soldiers inside the parade ground doing drills. Here on the left is an aerial of the fort in 1929, and the right shows Fort Seward Hospital in 1945. Following the end of World War II, the fort was decommissioned and a group of World War II veterans acquired the buildings and started a collective called the Fort Chilkoot Company. They turned the fort into a residential and cultural area and worked to preserve its buildings. The post-war era of the fort deserves its own historical society presentation, so maybe next year. And now for a very brief visual tour of the historic district today. Here we have Officers Row. This group of colonial revival homes is on the top side of the parade ground, which is the southwest boundary. These buildings have commanding views of the fort and Chilkoot Inlet, and today they function as duplexes, single-family homes, and an apartment. On the far left side of the slide, you can see the historic surgeon's quarters painted white with dark green trim. On the right side of the slide is officers' quarters 4 and 5. And by the way, if you're interested in buying one of these officers' quarters, one's currently for sale. According to Zillow, it will cost you $780,000. Here on the left, this slide shows the commanding officers' quarters 53, which is a part of the Helsingland Hotel now. On the right is the 60-foot high fire hall, which was originally constructed in 1904. In 2014, the owner reconstructed the tower, which had been partially replaced sometime after the fort was decommissioned in 1946. It now resembles the tower from the early historic period. On the left side is a hospital, which was constructed in 1904. The hospital is a contributing resource in the district and retains many of the character-defining features of a standardized colonial revival buildings on Army installations during the period, and of the first round of the Surgeon General's standardized hospitals. On the right is the double company barracks 16 and 17. And I believe the Chilkoot Indian Association is in the process of using the hospital as a space for art projects in the near future, and may have already started. Here on the left are the two non-commissioned officers' quarters that are visible along Soapsuds Alley. These are two-story duplexes that were constructed in 1904, and on the right is the Post Exchange building constructed in 1904. It was identified on the 1905 site plan as the Post Exchange and Gym. And this concludes the brief tour and history of Fort William H. Seward Historic District. I used this final photo taken from the ferry as an attempt to capture the beauty and grandeur of the fort setting, but really you need to see it in person. As you saw in some of the photos, the fort is incredibly intact and well preserved, especially for an Alaska Gold Rush military fort. Its role in American history is unique and extraordinary, and the local community does a tremendous job working hard to preserve this important place. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. That was a great presentation. Again, we're going to hold questions until the end, but we have another remote presentation, and this one is by Jared Friedline. He's a graduate student at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. His research interests are American and world cartography. He was going to be here in person, but of course, the hurricane situation in Florida prevented his travel, and that's why he's going to be doing this remotely. But he'll be speaking also about another border disputes all along the entire Alaskan border, and speaking to the evolution of the responsibilities of the Alaskan border. So,
Eric, will you
Hello?
stop sharing your
Can you hear me?
screen?
Yep.
Eric, you have to stop sharing your screen, please. Eric.
Trying here. Sorry, I'm working to make that happen.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Jared.
No, it's okay. Take your time. It's okay.
Come on, anyway.
Why won't it?
It's always a challenge to share your
It
screen.
should be on the top of your screen. You can. It's a pull down menu that you could see. Yeah, let me see if I can share my screen.
Kayla's gonna be taking charge
Oh,
here.
there we go.
There, okay.
Did that work?
Yep,
That worked.
okay.
Oh,
Okay. Sorry, Jared.
sorry.
Jared, you're gonna be sharing yours now?
Can you see my screen?
Okay,
Yes.
yep, perfect. Okay,
Cool.
go ahead, Jared.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Jared Friedline, and today I will present the evolution of the responsibilities of the Alaskan border. First, I want to thank the University of Central Florida for providing me a conference grant to sadly not attend but participate in this conference. So thank you, UCF, for that funding. So our journey starts in 1867 with the signing of the Treaty of Cession and its terms. In the treaty terms, the new boundary of the Alaskan Territory are established for both land and sea. What you see here is a map created by J.F. Lewis in 1867. J.F. Lewis was a British draftsman during the late 1800s. That means a draftsman was a person that would create detailed maps of either urban and rural areas or big land masses, just like the Alaskan territory. This map is special because it was made during the transfer of the Alaskan territory. And then you can see in the title, Map of Russian America or the Alaskan territory. And this is really interesting story about J.F. Lewis actually went with both the Russian Navy to map out the coast of the Alaskan territory and worked with American telegraph companies to when the American telegraph companies came into Alaska to build telegraphs and stations, he worked with them and mapped up the area with them. And it's interesting because J.F. Lewis was also British, so you get all three, Russian, American, and British, all three in one map, which is really cool. And he also went by the Treaty of Sessions created. And I'm just going to read a portion of the treaty to get a sense of what he was working with while creating the map and remember the influence of the Russian Navy and the telegraph companies as well. So, commencing from the southernmost point of the island called Prince of Wales Island, which point lies in the parallel of 54 degrees 44 minus north latitude, and between the 134th and the 133rd degree west longitude, meridian of Greenwich, that said shall ascend the north along the channel called Portland Channel as far as the point of the continent where strikes the 56th degree of north latitude. From this last mentioned point, the line of demarcation shall follow the summit of the mountains, situated parallel with the coast as far as the point of intersection of the 144th degree of the west longitude. So you get the border with British Columbia, and then you get the maritime, which is 10 marine leagues from the ocean. So you get this line. If you can see my cursor, this line establishing the separate from the Russian Empire to now the Alaskan territory. So then in Article 2 of the Treaty of Sessions, in the cessions of territory and dominion made by the preceding article are included the rights of property in all public lots and squares, vacant lands, and all public buildings, fortifications, barracks, and other entities which are not private individual property. It is, however, understood and agreed that churches which have been built on ceded territory by the Russian government shall remain the property of such members of the Greek Oriental Church, residents in the territory, as many as may choose to worship within. Any government archives, papers, and documents related to the territory and dominion aforesaid, which may now exist there, and will left in the possession of the agent of the United States, but an authenticated copy of such of them may be required, will be in all times given to by the United States to the Russian government, or to such the Russian officer or subject they may apply for. And this is interesting because this map, as you can see, is found both in the Library of Congress and in Moscow in the Russian archive. So you see this division of documents both shared by the United States and the Russian Empire during this time. And by understanding this, J.F. Lewis understood that British Columbia, Canada now, would be basically blocked from using the Pacific Ocean, and the United States will have the main access to the Pacific during this time. And now again to the people. I know other presenters mentioned this in their presentations. It's time to talk about people who lived in the Alaskan territory during this transfer, as Russian citizens living in the boundary of the Alaskan territory were given 3 years to either move back to Russian mainland or to receive American citizenship. However, native/and indigenous people that lived in Alaska were not allowed to receive American citizenship. And it's the wording in Article 3 of the treaty is very concerning modern times. And I have the Article 3 of the treaty here. Our policy is clear since we have give me a second, sorry. Okay, sorry. The inhabitants of the ceded territory, according to their choice, resolve their natural allegiances, may return to Russia within 3 years, but if they should prefer to remain in the ceded territory, they, with the exception of uncivilized native tribes, shall be admitted to the enjoyment of all the rights, advantage, and immunities of a citizens of the United States, and shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of the liberty, property, and religion. The uncivilized tribes will be subject to such laws and regulations as the United States may, from time to time, adopt in regular to Aboriginal tribes in the country. So you see in the treaty that the Native Americans did not have say in the treaty, and also the Russian citizens in this during in the Alaskan territory at this time were given everything. You get Americans, and the United States government will now protect you and will help you move back to Russia, while the treaty describes the native/indigenous people as uncivilized, and anytime they would like, they can change the rule, and the native/indigenous peoples will have to obey by the new laws at a given whim, which would be crazy to hear during all time. So next slide. Oh, sorry. That's not good. Whoa. Okay, next slide. There we go. So reporting on the purchase of Alaska. So right now you see three different news articles created during this time. Two from the United States, Chicago Evening Journal and Portland Daily Oregon. And then you have one from the London Times created in Britain during this time. And for sake of time, I would just read the British portion of the British news article would be, our policy is clear. Since we have no right whatever to protest against an act entirely within the discretion of the Russian and the United States government, let us not place ourselves in a false position by vain remonstrance. It is said that British Columbia is almost cut off from the Pacific by the occupation by what ought to be a portion of its seaboard. Its sufficient answer is that it was effectively cut off before Americans and only bought what belonged to Russia, and no Englishman ever dreamt that Russian would part it with us. We are maturely no worse off than before. While morale right now is not own possession, remains absolutely untouched. So that was during the transfer, the sense of, oh, well, the United States just got bigger and we are now cut off from the land, but it's okay because it was never all land right now. So it's okay, don't worry, everybody. But it sucks because now the United States controls the Pacific Ocean. So this is the start of the border lines and during the transfer. Now, if we go to jump ahead to the 1810s and 1840s, we see the United States really putting infrastructure into the Alaskan border and expanding the border now to more radio waves and aerospace. From the 1910s to 1940s, the United States will go through major events, World War I, and start of World War II, and the Alaskan boundary will be transformed forever. With the popularization of the radio and airplanes during this time frame, this created a new boundary called airspace. And then here's a map from 1951 of all the radios and airspaces that were created during this time frame. And they have like the governor's mansion highlighted and all the radio sections, so airplanes and military personnel could communicate throughout the territory. And so this is before Cold War fears. This is after Japan, after World War II, where the United States was trying to still conquer the Pacific Ocean and maintain a presence there. So you need the infrastructure of radios, airplanes, airports, and military bases to maintain that Pacific control during this time frame. So next slide. So then you get into Cold War Alaska, 1950s to 1960s. And during the 1950s, 60s, relations with the USSR has been tense, and the United States was worried about losing Alaska to the Soviet Union during this time frame. So the United States created air defense across the state, well, not state yet, going to be a state soon, territory, and create almost a space boundary with only warning ballistic systems. So these systems across the state, as you can see, will only warning detections in case a nuclear or ballistic missile would come across and try to hit mainland the United States. And so the United States developed more and more ballistic stations across the state, and that warning system introduced a space element, understand how to control the space outside the air control and how to prevent ballistic missiles from reaching Alaska and to the lower 49 states of America. And you can see here it's protecting the Anchorage is mainly protected with the aircraft control and warning systems because that's the capital of Alaska. They want to protect Alaska, the capital, at all costs. And then you see the dew line going across the border of the Arctic Ocean to prevent submarine strikes that would come up from the ocean there. And you can see one of the base and the border of Canada as well during times worrying about Soviet influence and threats on Alaska. So then the next slide would be the native indigenous boundaries. So right now lastly, in 1971, the United States passed the Alaska Native Claims Act, and that allowed native indigenous people to claim land for the tribe and allow them to govern themselves based on their tribal laws. The creation of that divided Alaska now into 12 different sections for tribes to go to claim land and resolve funding for the tribe and land management. This creation of the boundaries in the state of Alaska allowed the native and the indigenous people to claim land that were once theirs before the Russian Empire sold Alaska to the United States. So my plan is for future researching is taking this map and using GIS to layer it over the 1968 version of the map to show what the boundaries would look like on that map, so it can hopefully help create more of a, before the United States bought it, provide more historical context to what actually the Native Americans and indigenous people lost during this time, and trying to revert back to, because the United States bought it just by the Russians and have no influence from the native indigenous people of Alaska, try to look at what land or claims that the natives would have back almost 100 years ago. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much. That's my presentation. Good.
Okay, Thanks, Jared. I think we're gonna change it so we can have both Eric and Jared. Okay, Jared up here, and Rebecca, why don't you join us up here and we can have any questions? Let's go ahead. and get
Jared,
that.
why don't you put your video back on? Because they're
Oh,
gonna.
sorry, give me a
Yeah.
second.
Yeah.
Sorry. Can you hear me? So you can see me?
Yep, yeah, we can see you. Thank you. Why don't we get a question and then I'll repeat it?
Okay.
Do we have questions from the audience here? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
South Alaska, mainly for Jared, I guess, in South Alaska, the Panhandle, the traditional territories by coastal and interior clinkage, not be overlapped. Was that considered at all?
Okay.
Well, like,
I don't think Jared can, Jared, you can't hear, can you? No, so I'm gonna have to repeat it. So speak to me.
yeah, anyway,
Okay,
considered at all, they would trade, you know.
okay, I guess,
So doing all that, Haku, Siki, you know, that it was, continuous in the native traditional territory, but it doesn't seem like it had any consideration in the boundary.
okay, and that might be for any of the speakers too, is that I think that the comment is that coastal and more interior Tlingits, their territories basically were contiguous or almost simultaneous because they traded up and down the rivers into the interior. And so was that taken into account in any of this kind of carving up and making the boundaries at this point? And I don't know, Rebecca, you might have some comment on that yourself. Do you want to?
Well, and I think I could answer for all three of us that no indigenous claims were not considered at all. It was, yeah.
So that, it didn't matter.
Yeah.
So,
And
In other
then
words,
the-
no.
sorry.
yeah, go ahead, Jared.
And in the treaty as well, it was only for the Russian Empire, or what they claim to be. And there's a check if you go to the National Archives online, they have the check, and the check is made out to only to the Russian Empire. The Native Americans never got any compensation from the federal government before the transfer in 1867. And so that's what I'm trying to do with putting the map of the 1867 J.F. Lewis map and trying to see what I can do is take the section and try to almost match and give back the claim for Native Americans to see what they lost in the transfer of Alaska from that map, because that's the a widespread only English version map that was both used by a British cartographer and he used sources from both United States and Russian influences as well, but no Native American influence in that map.
Yeah, I think that does raise an interesting question, what native claims would have looked like if they had been done 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, before that happened. Another question?
I was
From the
gonna say
Oh,
real
go ahead,
quick,
Eric. Go ahead.
during the boundary dispute, there was a delegation of Chilcats from the Klukwang village who I believe traveled to Skagway to petition commissioners trying to retain their rights, subsistence rights, fishing, hunting, trading across the boundary. I don't know how well that was granted, but there were sort of lobbying efforts because they knew, that this boundary dispute could change some of their traditions. And there's a famous photo, I think, but there's a photo that exists showing the delegation in Skagway in this hall where they're talking to the commissioners.
Yeah, I think there's a photo of that in Skagway, isn't there, Eric? I think I've seen
I
that.
think so.
Yeah. Question from the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
Becca, I wanted to talk a little bit on how, what leaders emerged from the Sheldon Jackson campus and overall how they influenced the trajectory of the boundaries over time, not specifically the boundaries, but the rights, I guess, of indigenous people. There was years for sure.
Okay, so the question is for Rebecca to speak to how Sheldon Jackson what's a college then? What was it? School, high school? And how that led to leadership that influenced the trajectory of Native leadership and Native claims throughout the state.
Yeah, so the Alaska Native Brotherhood, it was, most of the founders had gone to the school. And that was founded explicitly to try to get lands. And that was, a couple individuals, Peter Simpson, William Paul. But yeah, it was, yeah, so it was one of those things, where like the, going along with what was required in order to get citizenship was, they did what they had to do in the context of the time in order to get that ultimate goal, which was not, the missionaries were not helpful in that specific goal. But yeah, they used the tools that they had.
So that kind of led to the development of the Brotherhood at that time, the Clicquot-Haida Brotherhood.
Or yeah, it was the Alaska Native Brotherhood, and it was founded in order to fight for recognition of land ownership.
Did you have a question or?
Yeah. Do you think that there was any plan in there that, or, support from the behaviors of Sheldon Jackson that his students would ultimately have a voice? Or would this be something that would be like, oh, good, now what happens?
What did we create?
Yeah, in the beginning, it's really clear they're basically at war with the clan system and with Tlingit power structures. And that's really evident in the early days. It's a war. And so, as far as, I guess that's what I want to say is it's like to separate out the, like their goals of promoting their mission and their, ideology and their conception of Native people as needing them versus, the things that came out of it. And some of those were, we could really see as contingent, on that situation. But just to look at history as more complicated. It's my job.
Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
Here you mentioned that Russian citizens could become American citizens, and the indigenous people could. And I wondered what happened to the Creole class of people, the history individuals that were there. And then,
Should we just do that question first? Okay, this is a question for you, Jared. Russian citizens could become American citizens, indigenous Native Alaskans could not. What about the Creole or mixed race citizens? What was their path?
It depended on, well, not what the skin tone was and if they could pass as a Russian citizen or not. It's also because, well, it was based on a racist system, and that only, so it's hard to prove, like, oh, how do you prove that you are a Russian citizen? What documentations do you have? And if you have the right documentations to prove, hey, I'm Russian, then you could apply for the citizenship and get a citizenship for within the 3 years. While Native Americans, if you are associated with them and all that, you kind of out of luck during this time frame. During the
So
3 years.
maybe power of association and the color of your skin. Yeah. Okay, so the question to Rebecca is whether at Sheldon Jackson and the missionary system there, whether mixed races were treated, how they were treated, was it similar or different? And kind of what was their assimilation trajectory, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's actually really interesting where people who were, even if they were, mixed ethnicity, if they were, living like the Russians or with the Russians, they were given citizenship. And so they were considered quote unquote white. And so that got really complicated in different parts of Alaska or especially initially in Sitka, those people were really looked down on because they were mixed race, by the Americans. And so they had to really defend their status as citizens. And I mentioned, they were not happy with the mission. Because I think that they saw that as a threat. And that was, throughout, for decades. They're really they're just on this ragged edge, between, the uncivilized, quote unquote, and the Americans who are coming in. And yeah, not easy, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Other questions over here? Questions from anyone? Yeah, go ahead,
So Rebecca,
Tom.
we're reading a lot about the boarding school system that it's, things that it did, broadly, nationally, and in Canada. Were there any ways in your mind that the Sitka operation was maybe different from the broader picture, or did it fit neatly into that category of boarding school?
Okay, so the question was whether, given the whole issue about boarding schools in the US and in Canada right now, was the Sitka boarding school, was it kind of in that same realm, or did it operate differently, or how did it fit in that spectrum?
Yeah, I think overall, all of the boarding schools, and Sheldon Jackson did get federal support, for several years. And the whole, purpose of those boarding schools was to, I don't know if you've seen, there's a really good boarding school report that came out last year. That really the purpose of the boarding schools was to separate Native people from their lands. And so Sheldon Jackson was definitely part of that. And throughout, like the years, they were very much, just taken for granted that, your Native identity was a handicap. It's really painful, to hear people, like even people my age, telling about that. And so in that way, it was very definitely much, a part of that whole system, and the public schools too. And the way, and then individual schools were very different. And I think Sheldon Jackson was, like all the people I've talked to who went there, really enjoyed it. And I think some of it was because it was private, you had to pay, you had to apply. And if you didn't like it, or you weren't cut out for boarding school, you left. But there are other schools, especially, Bureau of Indian Affairs schools, where people were taken from, what was seen as unfit homes and taken against their will and against their parents' will and taken and placed. That was like the Wrangell Institute was one infamous one. And yeah, and then that situation, that's a setup. There were predators who were, protected, who, were at that school and preying on these kids who were, taken from a traumatic situation, put through more trauma and placed into this place where they had no protection. And so there's a whole spectrum, and even Wrangell Institute, I know people who went there as high school students and found it a good place. But yeah, it's really complicated. And I think education policy is something, like public schools and boarding schools is something that we really need to look at and see if we can do better.
Any follow-up questions there? Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I couldn't see you in the back. Yes, go ahead. So the question, I think, and let me just repeat this and see if if I've captured it correctly, is that there are a number of Russian Orthodox churches all around the state, and they seem, from your perspective, to be more successful, perhaps because they didn't have boarding schools and force kids to come to their schools. Is that your question? It might be a comparative factor to others.
Yeah, and what makes it complicated is when the Russians were here and they had missionaries here, the missionaries were being missionaries. They were telling people masks were evil. They were telling people dancing was evil. They were telling them, all that cultural stuff was evil. And they did keep the language, and that's a big difference. But they were missionaries, and that was in the Russian days. And in the American times, like especially as like a pushback from Sheldon Jackson and the success of that mission, the Russian Orthodox Church, that's when it really got, in Sitka anyway, the native membership. And it really became, to some extent indigenized, and some of that was because the Russians who were in charge of that church were very far away. There was very little staff on the ground here. And so, they couldn't say, oh, no, you can't do that. And it really, was embraced by Sitkas. There's still a large Tlingit Orthodox congregation in Sitka. So anyway, just to look at the mission, like the Presbyterian missions had all the force of the United States government behind it. And by that time, the Russian Orthodox Church didn't have much force behind it. But back in the Russian days, they were just as much down on culture.
And I don't think we have anybody speaking to this, but there has been a certain amount of carving up of the state by the various churches, whether it's Quakers or Catholics or Moravians or Methodists and Russian Orthodox. And I know there's been a lot of work and studies done on that. Rachel, did you have? Okay, back there. Oh, okay, sorry, Tom, go ahead.
Greatly outnumbered. Right. And, how long that they really were, what on earth, what really come? And that's how they operate. And at the time of the purchase, you have to ask the question, who offered who? I mean, it's just basically, indigenous people, on what? As a place, one Catholic,
Okay, so Tom Bunsen is just commenting that you have to take into account that at the time of the purchase, that primarily Creole or mixed races vastly outnumbered, I guess, pure Russians at that time, and that the Russians at that time were primarily company men, I would suppose. Okay, any other response to that by any of the speakers? Jeff? Okay. Like violent, potentially violent, or just intense? Okay, so the question to Eric is whether the boundary dispute ever got, in Jeff's word, hairy, but I guess that also means intense or, yeah.
That one quote that I gave during the presentation was sort of the, you see sort of those types of accounts where it looks like it could have come to like a little bit of a skirmish. Nothing too bad. I mean, it could have been a lot worse. I feel like if hotter tempers were in the room or didn't prevail. Of course, there was all sorts of lawlessness to contend with just from the population that was coming in. Yeah, no shots fired that I know of.
Thanks, Eric. And I know we still have some boundary disputes with Russia over Wrangel Island, and now with the Outer Continental Shelf extension, there's bound to be, there are certainly disputes over that. So I think there's also a lot of room for discussion of a lot of these things in the future. So I guess I would just ask, okay, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
One more thing, I was gonna
Oh,
plug,
go ahead.
Chris Allen wrote a good article that was in one of our Alaska journals about a rabble rouser who was operating around this time, taking down Union Jack flags. But I encourage members to go back and read that. I think it was in our issue that was the first redesign issue. So in the spring it came out, and it's worth reading.
Okay, and that was by whom, Eric?
It was by Chris Allen.
Okay. All right.
I
Tom.
wondered if anybody ever built a wall.
Oh, so Tom asked if anyone has proposed building a wall. Probably not. But actually, maybe so, actually, the US, the Alaska-Canada border, kind of the northern border, at least there's been, I mean, it's definitely a line there that you can see by air. Any closing comments from any of our speakers? Anything you feel like you needed to address that you weren't able to? Let's see, a comment from Cynthia Wentworth. She gave a presentation this morning concerning the Wrangell Institute. Yes. Okay, well, with that, I want to give a big hand to all of our speakers. Thank you so much, and to our audience. So thank you all for being here. Thank you. And just a reminder that these are being recorded and that they'll be available on the Historical Society website sometime soon.